Hello, it's me again, your storyteller in case of sleepless nights, ready to immerse myself in another monotonous story from the boring bedtime story series. Today we will travel back in time to reveal the dark and not too romantic secrets of medieval royal weddings. Before we begin, dim the lights, make yourself comfortable on your soft pillow, and leave the modern world at the door. If you like what you hear, like and subscribe, but only if you want to. No pressure. In the comments, write where you are listening from and what time you have. Now take a deep breath, relax, and let's go on a journey. We will immerse ourselves in an era where castles were cold and politics were even colder. An era where marriage was not the union of two hearts, but the fusion of two crowns, and where the word love was rarely uttered during wedding negotiations. Forget everything you've seen in fairy tales. The reality was much more prosaic and cruel. Imagine a world lit only by candles and fireplaces, a world where the borders of states were constantly changing, like sand in the wind. In this world, you are not just a person, you are a princess or a prince, but this does not mean that your life belongs to you. On the contrary, from birth, you are not a person, but an asset. Your worth is not measured by your talents or dreams, but by the lands, armies, and titles you can bring to your future spouse. A wedding for you is not a celebration of love, but the culmination of many years, and sometimes 10, negotiations, where every word in the marriage contract is weighed on the scales of political benefit. You are a living commodity, the most valuable piece on the chessboard of Europe. Your hand is a prize in a game where the stake is the survival and prosperity of entire dynasties. Ambassadors travel for weeks, if not months, along broken roads, risking their lives to deliver a portrait and negotiate terms. These portraits, by the way, were often far from reality, representing more political advertising than an accurate depiction. Artists were paid to hide flaws and emphasize virtues because the success of the mission depended on it. The negotiations were conducted with cold prudence. How much land will be included in the dowry? What trade routes will be opened? Who will give up their claims to disputed territories? These questions were much more important than whether you could find a common language with your future husband or wife, whom you most likely never met. Love, compatibility, these concepts were luxuries that royal families could not afford. It was believed that if you endure it, you will fall in love, and if not, then it did not matter as long as the queen was able to give birth to heirs, and the king was able to protect the borders. You have been prepared for this role since childhood. Girls were taught languages, etiquette, and household management not for self-development, but so that they could adequately represent their new homeland and not disgrace their family. Boys were taught military affairs and diplomacy so that they could effectively use their marriage to build power. Feelings were suppressed. Personal desires were ignored. You were a tool in the hands of your parents and counselors. Rejection of the proposed alliance was unthinkable and tantamount to high treason. This could have provoked war, destroyed the fragile peace, and led to the death of thousands of people. The pressure was enormous. The whole weight of the future of the two kingdoms fell on your young shoulders. And so, when the contract is finally signed, the parchment is sealed with wax seals. You set off on a journey to meet your destiny, to a foreign country, to a person whose face you know only from an embellished portrait. Your childhood is officially over, and a life full of duty, intrigue, and loneliness begins where your body and your will no longer belong to you. They are the property of the crown. Imagine a cradle. Soft wood, perhaps decorated with modest carvings, or if the family is very wealthy, encrusted with precious stones. Inside lies a baby, wrapped in diapers, not yet knowing the world, not knowing how to speak, not understanding his place in the complex hierarchy of life. And now imagine that next to this cradle there are not only loving parents, but also stern ambassadors from a distant country, who look at this baby not with tenderness, but with cold calculation. They do not see a child, but the future of their nation. A pledge of peace, a key to new territories. In this world, where the average life expectancy was barely 40 years and infant mortality was appallingly high, waiting until adulthood to enter into a union was an inadmissible luxury. Politics could not wait. Therefore, betrothal, and sometimes full-fledged marriage ceremonies, were held when the future spouses were still children, and sometimes babies. This was not something out of the ordinary. This was standard diplomatic practice. Marriage between children was a way to seal agreements for decades to come. While you were learning to walk and say your first words, your future was already written out in great detail in the marriage contract. Your hand was promised to the same child hundreds of kilometers away, whom you may not see for many years. These betrothal ceremonies, or proxy marriages, per verba de praesenti, were carried out with the utmost seriousness. Sometimes one of the ambassadors would literally go to bed with the infant princess to symbolically complete the union, although of course there was no question of physical consummation until puberty. But the very fact of this ritual emphasized the inviolability of the concluded deal. The child became a hostage to the policy of his parents. You grow up knowing that your life doesn't belong to you. Instead of fairy tales about love, you are told about dynastic commitments. Instead of playing with peers, there are lessons in the language and culture of the country that will one day become your home and your prison. Every action you take, every word you say is judged in terms of how it will affect your future marriage. You are an investment, and dividends are expected from you. Sometimes children were sent to be raised at the court of the future spouse. Imagine a 5-year-old girl, torn away from her mother, from everything she knows, and sent on a long and dangerous journey to a foreign country. She arrives at a court where a different language is spoken, where customs are different, where she is surrounded by strange faces. She should grow up next to her future husband, the same child, so that they get used to each other. But more often than not, this led not to attachment, but to a deep sense of loneliness and alienation. She was a stranger among her own people, a pawn in a game that she did not yet understand. When the age of consent came, which, according to canon law, was only 12 years for girls and 14 for boys, a real wedding was held. But even then, these two were, in fact, still children, teenagers thrown into the world of adult intrigues and responsibilities. They were forced to share a bed, to fulfill marital duty, on which the future of the kingdom depended. The psychological trauma from such an experience was enormous, but no one paid attention to it. The main thing is the birth of an heir. These child marriages were the quintessence of medieval pragmatism, where human life and childhood were sacrificed on the altar of state necessity. The cradle and the marriage bed were dangerously close, and innocence was the price that the children of kings paid for their blue blood. As soon as the wedding celebration subsided and the guests left, the most severe test began for the young queen. Her journey, negotiations, dowry, all this was only a prelude to her main and, in fact, only mission. A mission on which not only her own fate depended, but also the stability of the entire kingdom. This mission was simple, and at the same time terrifyingly difficult: to give birth to an heir, and not just an heir, but a healthy boy who will one day inherit the throne. From the moment she crossed the threshold of the palace, her entire existence was reduced to the state of her womb. She ceased to be a person, turning into a vessel for the continuation of the dynasty. Each month became a period of agonizing anticipation and fear for her. The pressure was not just internal, it was omnipresent and tangible. The ladies of the court, who had smiled at her the day before, were now carefully watching her every step, the slightest change in her figure. Her mother-in-law, the Queen Mother, did not see her as a daughter-in-law, but only as a tool to ensure the future of her son and her dynasty. Her morning indisposition became the subject of gossip in all the corridors of the castle. Her appetite, complexion, mood were all analyzed and interpreted as a possible sign of pregnancy. Doctors with serious faces examined her, gave dubious advice, and prescribed decoctions of herbs that were supposed to increase her fertility. Prayers for the conception of an heir were offered in all the churches of the kingdom. All the people, from the peasant to the duke, were waiting for news from the king's bedroom. If pregnancy did not occur during the first year, whispering began. Quiet at first, then louder. Who is the problem? In the king or in the queen? Of course, suspicion almost always fell on the woman. Male infertility was a topic that was avoided because it questioned the king's masculinity and divine right to rule. Therefore, it was the queen who was accused of infertility, or empty flowering. She could be forced to undergo humiliating rituals, pilgrimages to holy places, wear amulets, and drink disgusting potions. Her position at court was becoming precarious. She was a stranger, a foreigner, and the only thing that could strengthen her status was a child. Without him, she remained vulnerable to intrigue and conspiracies. Rival factions at court could begin to promote the idea of annulling the marriage so that the king could marry another, more prolific candidate. The birth of a daughter was both a joy and a disappointment. The girl, of course, was also a valuable asset. She could be married off profitably, but she could not inherit the throne in most kingdoms. The birth of a daughter meant that the queen would have to go through it all again, after 9 months of anxious waiting through pain and the risk of childbirth, in the hope that next time it would be a boy, and this could go on for years. Year after year, she gave birth to daughters, and each time her situation became more desperate. She saw how her husband's interest was fading, how the hostility of the court was growing. Its only function, its main task, remained unfulfilled. In this cruel world, a queen without a son was almost nothing. Her beauty, her intelligence, her kindness, all of this didn't matter if her body couldn't give the kingdom what it demanded most. Now let's talk about the moment that, in modern ideas, is the most intimate and personal in the life of a couple: the wedding night. Forget about rose petals, champagne, and gentle whispers in private. In the medieval royal world, this night was not yours. It belonged to the state, the church, and dozens of prying eyes. The consummation of marriage, the physical union of the spouses, was not an act of love or passion, but a legal and political necessity that had to be witnessed. Therefore, it turned into a public, carefully staged, and deeply humiliating performance. Imagine this surreal theater. The wedding feast is coming to an end, but instead of leaving the newlyweds alone, the most high-ranking guests, bishops, dukes, royalty, escort them to the bedroom. The bedroom, which was supposed to be a refuge, turns into a stage. It is brightly lit by candles. It is hot and stuffy from the breath of many people. The priest blesses the marriage bed by sprinkling it with holy water, as if it were an altar for sacrifice. And in a sense, it was. The sacrifice was your intimacy, your dignity. Court ladies undress the bride, commenting on her figure, giving unsolicited advice. The men do the same with the king, making rude jokes and cheering him on. You're standing there practically naked in front of people you barely know, feeling their appraising glances on you. It was a ritual designed to confirm that the marriage took place not only in words, but also in deeds. In a world where the annulment of a marriage was possible on the basis of its non-consummation, the presence of witnesses was a guarantee that the union could not be challenged in the future. Then you are put to bed. The canopy of the bed is twitching, but this is only a symbolic obstacle. The witnesses do not leave. They stay in the room or right outside the door, listening to every sound, every rustle. The silence in the room becomes deafening, interrupted only by the cough or nervous laughter of one of the guests. You are lying next to a person who is, in fact, a stranger to you. Perhaps you are afraid, disgusted, or simply completely indifferent, but you have to do your duty. The legitimacy of your marriage, and therefore the legitimacy of your future children, depends on it. Any sign that you failed could be interpreted as a bad omen, or even as proof of impotence or witchcraft. Sometimes the ritual went to extremes. The next morning, sheets with evidence of consummation and virginity of the bride could be put on public display. This was the final confirmation that everything went as it should. For a young girl who grew up within the strict bounds of decency, this experience was not just humiliating, it was traumatic. He blurred the line between public and private, turning her body into state property. This ritual was a cruel reminder of her role. She was not a wife, not a lover, but a producer of heirs, and every step of the process was subject to social control. All the romance we associate with a wedding was shattered by the harsh reality of this public ceremony. It was a night when two men, often very young and frightened, had to do their duty under the watchful eye of the entire court, laying the foundation stone for the future dynasty at the cost of their own humiliation. So, the marriage contract is signed, the betrothal takes place, and the dowry is agreed. Now for the young princess, often still a teenage girl, the moment was coming that she had both been waiting for and dreading: a trip to her new home, to the kingdom of her future husband. This path was not like a modern trip in a comfortable car or plane. It was a long, grueling, and deadly undertaking that could take weeks, if not months. Imagine leaving the only home you've ever known, saying goodbye to your family, perhaps forever, and venturing into the unknown. Your world shrinks to the size of a carriage or saddle, and your constant companions are shaking, cold, and fear. Roads in the Middle Ages were nothing more than muddy, broken ruts. After the rain, they turned into an impassable swamp, where carriages got stuck up to the axle and horses broke their legs. In dry weather, The dust stood in a column, clogged in the lungs, eyes, and clothes. The journey was painfully slow. It was possible to overcome no more than 30 to 40 kilometers per day. Every evening we had to look for a place to spend the night. If you were lucky, it was the castle of a friendly lord, where you could count on a warm bed and hot food. But most often they had to stay in monasteries or inns, where the conditions were far from royal. Dirt, drafts, bed bugs, and questionable food were commonplace. For a princess accustomed to luxury, it was a real shock. But the discomfort was the least of the problems. The main threat was danger. The roads were teeming with robbers and mercenaries for whom the wedding cortege, loaded with dowry and valuables, was a tasty prey. The guards, no matter how numerous, could not always protect against a sudden attack from the forest. Every stranger on the way aroused suspicion. In addition, there was a constant political threat. Your father's or your future husband's enemies may have tried to kidnap you in order to disrupt a strategically important alliance. You were a valuable prize, and there were plenty of hunters for it. Every day of the journey was a game with death, where not only your life was at stake but also peace between the two states. In addition to bandits, there was another invisible threat: diseases. In conditions of unsanitary conditions, overcrowding, and poor nutrition, any epidemic could mow down half of the motorcade. Dysentery, typhus, smallpox, these diseases traveled with people. A simple cold could develop into a fatal pneumonia. Medical care was primitive and often did more harm than good. Crossing borders, you found yourself in new climatic conditions, encountered unfamiliar food and water, which made your body even more vulnerable. And all the while, you were surrounded by your entourage, but you felt incredibly alone. You were going to meet a person you didn't know, to a country whose customs you feared, leaving behind everything you loved. This long walk down the aisle was not a romantic adventure, but a severe test of endurance, courage, and faith, the first of many that awaited you in your new life. When the grueling journey finally came to an end, and the wedding day came, the royal court exploded with a display of ostentatious luxury. The wedding feast was not just a dinner. It was an elaborate spectacle designed to dazzle the guests, to demonstrate the wealth and power of the host. Imagine a huge hall of the castle, decorated with tapestries, on which scenes of hunting and battles are woven. Long oak tables are bursting with viands. The air is filled with the hum of hundreds of voices, the sounds of the lute and flute, the laughter and loud commands of the servants. It was a sight for the eyes, a feast for the senses, but behind this facade of abundance lay a completely different, much less appetizing reality. The most exotic dishes that could be obtained were put on the tables. Roasted peacocks and swans, served in their own plumage to make it look like they are alive. Huge pies from which, after cutting, live birds could fly out, or a court jester could jump out. Boar heads with an apple in their mouths. Mountains of meat, venison, beef, pork, cooked on skewers over an open fire. Spices that cost a fortune, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, were used in unimaginable quantities, not only to demonstrate status, but also to kill the taste and smell of meat, which was often not the first freshness. Wine and ale flowed like a river from huge barrels, and the more the guests drank, the louder and coarser the feast became. However, behind this splendor was hidden everywhere dirt. Forget about elegant cutlery. Forks were rare and considered a suspicious Italian innovation. People ate with their hands or with a knife that they carried with them. Greasy fingers wiped on bread or clothes. Bones and leftovers were thrown directly on the floor under the table, where they were picked up by dogs that walked freely around the hall. The thatched floor was rarely changed, and food residues, spilled wine, and animal excrement accumulated in it, creating an unimaginable stench that was only slightly masked by the aromas of incense and herbs. The personal hygiene of the guests also left much to be desired. There was no concept of regular washing, and the smells of unwashed bodies mixed with the aromas of food and smoke from fireplaces. The manners at the table were far from refined. Loud belching was considered a sign of pleasure from eating. People chomped, talked with their mouths full, blew their noses right into the tablecloth or on the floor. Arguments that turned into fights were commonplace, especially after a few goblets of strong wine. The noise was unimaginable. In this chaos of luxury and filth sat the young bride, often frightened and bewildered. She had to maintain her royal dignity in the midst of this barbaric feast, eat food that seemed strange or disgusting to her, and smile at people whose mannerisms shocked her. The wedding feast was a microcosm of medieval life, bright, cruel, full of sharp contrasts. It was a world where ostentatious luxury coexisted with primeval filth, and gourmet meals were served in an environment that we would today consider completely unsanitary. When you imagine a medieval royal bride, what image arises in your mind? Most likely, this is a girl in a lush, snow-white dress, a symbol of purity, innocence, and romance. This image is so firmly rooted in our culture, thanks to fairy tales and Hollywood films, that it seems to be an indisputable truth. However, like many of our other ideas about the Middle Ages, it has almost nothing to do with reality. The white wedding dress is a relatively recent tradition, only popularized in the 19th century by Queen Victoria. For a medieval princess to appear at her own wedding in a white dress would not only be strange, but unthinkable and impractical. A wedding dress in that era was not a symbol of innocence, but a powerful political statement. Its main task was to demonstrate the wealth, status, and influence of the bride's family. The more expensive and luxurious the outfit, the more powerful her dynasty was considered. Therefore, dresses were sewn from the most expensive fabrics that money could buy. Velvet, silk, brocade, often brought from afar along the Great Silk Road. The colors were bright, saturated, and deep. Those dyes that were difficult to obtain were the most valued. Purple, scarlet, indigo, rich blue. These colors screamed status, because only the richest families could afford them. White, on the other hand, was impractical. In a world without dry cleaners and washing machines, it was almost impossible to keep white cloth clean, and it was associated more with mourning in some cultures or with the clothes of people who had taken religious vows. The dress was a real work of art and a demonstration of capital. It was embroidered with gold and silver threads, decorated with hundreds or even thousands of precious stones, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and pearls. Fur, especially ermine or sable, was used to trim the sleeves and hem, which was also a sign of the highest aristocratic status. Such a dress weighed many kilograms and cost a fortune, sometimes comparable to the cost of a small estate. It was so valuable that it was not worn only once. After the wedding, it was carefully stored, altered, and worn on other solemn occasions or inherited. It was an investment, not a one-time outfit. The style of the dress also mattered. Long, flowing sleeves, a train that took meters of expensive fabric. All this emphasized that its owner led an idle lifestyle and did not need to work with her hands. Each element of the outfit was thought out and carried a certain meaning. For example, certain colors or patterns could indicate the heraldic symbols of her family, or even contain political allusions to new alliances. Thus, when the bride walked down the aisle, she was not just a girl getting married. It was a living declaration of power. Her dress told the story of her origins, her family's wealth, and the political power she brought with her to the new kingdom. It was not a whisper of innocence, but a loud declaration of power, woven with silk and adorned with precious stones. We've already talked about how the royal wedding was, in fact, a deal, and any transaction has a price. In the world of medieval diplomacy, that price was the dowry. It was not a symbolic gift from the bride's family, as we might think today. The dowry was the cornerstone of the entire marriage union, the subject of long, fierce, and scrupulous negotiations. Its size and composition depended on whether the marriage would take place at all. For the groom's family, the dowry was compensation for the expenses they would incur in welcoming a new member into the family, the future queen, who would need to be kept for the rest of her days in appropriate luxury. But more importantly, it was a direct injection of capital, land, or political influence into their kingdom. Dowry negotiations could last for years. Ambassadors shuttled between the two courts, passing proposals and counter-proposals. Each side tried to bargain for the best terms for itself. What was included in the dowry? It could be anything of value. Most often it was money, huge sums of gold and silver which could replenish an empty treasury, finance a war, or the construction of a new castle. For example, Catherine of Braganza's dowry, when she married King Charles II of England, included not only a huge sum of money but also the strategically important ports of Tangier and Bombay, which forever changed the geopolitical landscape. In addition to money, the dowry included land. Entire provinces, duchies, or counties could change hands as part of a wedding deal. These territorial concessions often became a source of future conflicts. If the terms of the treaty were not formulated clearly enough, or one of the parties later refused to fulfill them, this could become a reason for many years. Bloody wars. The 100 Years' War between England and France, for example, was largely caused by complex dynastic and territorial claims arising from previous marriage alliances. Thus, the dowry was not just the price of alliance, but also the seed of potential discord. In addition, the dowry could include trade privileges, renunciation of claims to the throne of another state, military assistance, or even unique values such as family jewels, works of art, rare manuscripts. For the bride, her dowry was her main trump card. The greater it was, the more valuable it was considered, and the stronger was its position at the new court. If her family delayed the payment of the dowry or did not fulfill the promise, the position of the young queen became extremely vulnerable. She could be bullied, humiliated, and she lost her leverage. All her value in the eyes of her husband and his court was directly related to the wealth that she brought with her. Thus, the dowry was the cold and calculating economic foundation on which the entire marriage was built. This was the price paid by the bride's family for the prestige, security, and political benefits that this union provided. Love and happiness did not have a price tag, but the future of kingdoms did, and it was clearly spelled out in the dowry column of the marriage contract. Imagine being torn out of your familiar world and transported to a completely foreign place. Everything around is unfamiliar: architecture, food, people's clothes. But the most important thing is that you do not understand what they are talking about. Their speech sounds to you like a meaningless set of sounds. You are desperately trying to catch even a word, even a hint of meaning, but in vain. You are surrounded by people, but at the same time you feel completely alone, isolated in a glass cocoon of silence and incomprehension. This was the feeling experienced by the young queen when she arrived at her husband's court. The language barrier wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a wall that separated her from her new life and turned her palace into a gilded cage. Of course, princesses were prepared from childhood for their future role, and teaching the language of the future husband was an important part of this preparation. But it's one thing to memorize words and grammar rules with a teacher in the silence of the classroom, and quite another to find yourself in the midst of lively, fast, colloquial speech full of dialectisms, slang, and cultural references that can't be learned from books. Arriving at the court, the young queen found that her book language was very different from that spoken here. She could understand formal addresses, but she was completely lost in ordinary conversation at dinner or during court entertainments. This isolation was not only social, but also political. Unable to communicate freely, she could not understand the court intrigues that were woven around her. She didn't know who to trust. Whispers in the corners, meaningful glances, jokes that caused laughter from everyone except her. All this created an atmosphere of constant anxiety and suspicion. She was deaf and dumb in a world where the word was a weapon. Any attempt to express one's opinion or give an order could be distorted by the translator, who could have pursued his own goals. She was completely dependent on the loyalty of her small retinue, who came with her, and on the few courtiers who knew her native language. This linguistic isolation made her incredibly vulnerable. She could not build a personal relationship with her husband. How can you build intimacy if you can't share your thoughts, fears, or just joke? She could not win the love and respect of her new subjects because to them she always remained a stranger, a foreigner who did not even speak their language. Her mother-in-law and other influential ladies of the court could easily manipulate her, taking advantage of her misunderstanding. Every day was an exam for her, which she was afraid to fail. She listened intently to the conversations, trying to guess their meaning by intonation and gestures, afraid to say something wrong, afraid to seem stupid or ignorant. Over time, of course, many queens mastered the language of their new homeland. But the first months, if not years, were a period of deep loneliness and alienation, when her only interlocutors were the walls of her luxurious but empty chambers. The royal court of the Middle Ages, with its pompous ceremonies and courtly manners, may seem like a refined and civilized place. But behind this brilliant facade was a world of fierce power struggles, a world where ambition was limitless and human life was inexpensive. For a young queen, especially a foreigner, this world was like a snake's nest. Every smiling courtier, every low bow could hide a mortal threat. Intrigues and poisons were as inseparable attributes of court life as tapestries on the walls and wine in goblets. To survive here meant learning not to trust anyone. From the moment she arrived, the queen became the center of a web of intrigue. She was not just the wife of the king, she was a representative of a certain political faction, a faction of her home country. Her rise meant the strengthening of her family's influence and the weakening of others, those who were in power before her arrival. Influential aristocratic families, advisors, favorites of the king, saw her as a direct threat to their position. They were losing access to the king, losing their privileges, and they were ready to do anything to regain their lost positions, or at least to prevent the new queen from gaining a foothold. Conspiracies were woven against her. Dirty rumors were spread that questioned her virtue, her loyalty, or even her mental health. The goal was to blacken her in the eyes of the king and court, isolate her and deprive her of all influence. But rumors were only one of the weapons. Much more real and terrible was the threat of physical elimination. In a world where medicine was powerless against many diseases, sudden death from stomach cramps or transient fever was rarely suspect. This created ideal conditions for the use of poison. Venom was a silent, discreet, and effective killer. It could be mixed into wine, food, applied to the pages of a book or to the fabric of gloves. Danger lurked everywhere. Every meal turned into a risky enterprise. That is why kings and queens had the position of taster, a person who tasted all the food and drinks before they were served to the monarch. This position was both honorable and deadly. The young queen had to be constantly on the alert. She could only trust a small circle of people, mainly those who came with her from her home country. The arrival of the new queen at court was not only a celebration, but also a powerful catalyst for change, upsetting the delicate balance of power. For many influential figures, dukes, barons, and even members of the royal family, she was not a welcome guest, but a threat. She represented the interests of another country. She had her own people, her own ambitions, and her appearance could ruin their plans and reduce their influence on the king. Therefore, from the moment she set foot on new land, she plunged into an invisible but deadly world of court intrigue, where smiles hid hatred, and polite words were saturated with venom. And sometimes this poison was not only metaphorical. Think of this world as a snake's nest. Every word you say is analyzed. Every gesture is interpreted. You have no real friends, only temporary allies. Factions at court are constantly fighting for the king's favor, for positions, lands, and wealth. You, as the new queen, unwittingly become the center of this struggle. One faction may try to make you their puppet. Another will seek to destroy you. Your own retinue, who have come with you, are under constant suspicion as a group of foreign spies. Any mistake, any wrong step can be used against you. A rumor spread in the hallway can ruin your reputation. Slander whispered in the king's ear can rob you of his trust and love. The danger was not only political, but also physical. History is full of examples of mysterious and sudden deaths at royal courts. People died of transient illness, fever, or indigestion, but these diagnoses often concealed cold-blooded murder. Poison was the favorite weapon of intriguers. It was quiet, efficient, and hard to detect. Arsenic, antimony, aconite. These substances were well known to medieval poisoners. They could be mixed into wine, food, rubbed into clothes, or even into the pages of a prayer book. The queen was more vulnerable than anyone else. She ate food prepared by someone else's hands, drank from goblets that were served to her by servants whose loyalty was in question. Therefore, there was a whole system of precautions at the court. The position of royal taster was not an honorary sinecure, but a deadly job. This person had to taste every dish and every drink before being touched by the monarch or his consort. But even this did not give an absolute guarantee. The taster could be bribed or intimidated. The poison could be slow-acting, accumulating in the body for weeks before delivering a fatal blow. The queen lived in a state of constant paranoia. She had to be suspicious of every gift, every treat. She could not trust even the doctors who could present her with poison under the guise of medicine. Her life was a fragile thread, stretched over the abyss of conspiracies. The palace that was supposed to be her home and fortress was actually the most dangerous place in the kingdom, a battlefield where not the strongest survived, but the most cautious and cunning. In a medieval world where life was permeated with faith and God's will was seen as the explanation for everything from the harvest to the outcome of battle, the church wielded tremendous power. It was not just a spiritual institution, but a powerful political and economic force whose influence extended to all aspects of life, and royal marriages were no exception. No royal union could be considered legitimate without the blessing of the church. A wedding ceremony performed by a bishop or archbishop was not just a ritual, but an act of legitimation. It was the church that declared marriage sacred and inviolable, sealed not only by people but also by God himself. This divine approval was vital for any monarch. It strengthened his right to the throne and made his future children the rightful heirs in the eyes of all Christendom. However, the Church was not an impartial arbiter, but an active player in the political arena. The Pope and his bishops have skillfully used their authority over the sacrament of marriage as a powerful tool to achieve their own goals. They could allow or prohibit marriage based on their political interests. For example, if a king wanted to marry a princess from a country hostile to the Papal States, he might encounter unexpected obstacles. Suddenly, it could turn out that the future spouses were too closely related, even if it was the seventh water on the jelly. Canon law had extremely strict and confusing rules regarding consanguinity, and the Church could interpret them as she saw fit to block an undesirable union. On the other hand, if the union was beneficial to the Church, it was easy for the Church to issue a special permit or dispensation, turning a blind eye to any obstacles. These permissions, of course, cost a lot of money to go to the papal treasury or required political concessions from the king, support in the fight against heretics, participation in a crusade, or the appointment of the right people to ecclesiastical positions in his kingdom. Thus, the royal wedding often became a bargaining chip not only between the two courts, but also with Rome. The king had to maneuver between the interests of his dynasty and the demands of the pontiff. The power of the Church over marriage gave her another formidable lever of pressure, the possibility of annulment. If the king became undesirable, or if the political situation changed, it was always possible to find a reason to declare his marriage null and void from the very beginning. The most common pretext was the same forbidden degree of kinship, which had previously been turned a blind eye. The annulment of the marriage plunged the kingdom into chaos. Children born in this union were declared bastards and lost their rights to the throne, which immediately led to a dynastic crisis and civil war. The famous story of Henry VIII and his break with Rome is the clearest example of how a conflict over a royal marriage could lead to a religious revolution and change the history of an entire country forever. Thus, the Church was not just a witness, but the third, and often the most important participant in any royal marriage, using its sacred right as an instrument of earthly power. In a world where science could not yet explain the vagaries of nature, where disease, crop failures, and sudden death seemed to be the manifestation of the will of invisible forces, people's lives were saturated with superstition. Medieval man lived in an enchanted world inhabited not only by angels and saints but also by demons, evil spirits, witches, and ghosts. These beliefs were so strong that they penetrated into all spheres of life, and the royal wedding, as one of the most important events, was surrounded by a whole host of strange and sometimes creepy rituals and ceremonies. Their goal was not just to celebrate the union, but to protect the newlyweds from the evil eye, spoilage, and any other evil influence that could interfere with their happiness, and most importantly, their fertility. Preparing for the wedding was a time of heightened vulnerability. It was believed that during this period the bride and groom, especially the bride, were easy prey for the dark forces. An envious look could cast a curse pronounced by a rejected admirer or political enemy, could lead to infertility or impotence. Therefore, all kinds of precautions were taken. They tried to hide the bride from prying eyes until the very day of the wedding. Bags of salt, iron, or strong-smelling herbs such as rosemary or garlic, which were believed to repel evil spirits, could be sewn into her clothes. Even the choice of the wedding date was not accidental. Astrologers calculated the most auspicious day based on the position of the stars, avoiding unlucky days such as Friday. The wedding ceremony itself was filled with symbolic actions aimed at protecting and ensuring well-being. For example, the bride's path to church could be strewn with flowers and herbs not only for beauty, but also to drive away evil spirits that could hide on the ground. Loud sounds, the ringing of church bells, the shouts of guests' music, also served this purpose, scaring away evil spirits. In some traditions, the groom's friends would arrange a noisy procession, shooting in the air and making as much noise as possible to protect him on his way to the bride. The exchange of rings was not just a symbol of eternity, but also a magical act that created a protective circle around the union. But the strangest rituals had to do with ensuring fertility, the main purpose of royal marriage. After the wedding, guests could be showered with grain, wheat, or rice. It was not just a gesture of congratulations, but an ancient pagan ritual symbolizing fertility and the wish for numerous offspring. In some regions, It was customary to place certain objects in the marriage bed, such as fish, which was associated with fertility, or even to perform rituals involving animal blood. Guests could give the newlyweds advice that would seem absurd and shocking to us today, such as recommending certain positions or actions during the wedding night to guarantee the conception of a boy. These superstitions were not just folklore. For the people of that time, these were vital practices, a way to cope with anxiety and uncertainty in a world full of dangers, visible and invisible. Each ritual was an attempt to take control of his destiny and protect the fragile future of the new dynasty from the chaos of a hostile world. We are used to a world where daily showers, deodorant, clean clothes, and a snow-white smile are the social norm. Our obsession with cleanliness is so great that we can hardly imagine an era where things were different. Let's do not the most pleasant but necessary for understanding the past. Immersion in the world of smells and sensations of the medieval royal court. Forget about the romantic images of knights and princesses fragrant with roses. The reality was much more odorous. Lack of personal hygiene in our modern sense was ubiquitous, and it left its mark on everything, including the most intimate moments, such as the wedding night. In the Middle Ages, taking a bath was a rare and difficult event. It wasn't like we just turn a faucet. It was necessary to heat a huge amount of water on the fire, drag it into a wooden tub, which was placed in the middle of the room, creating a terrible draft. It was expensive, time-consuming, and considered more of a medical procedure or luxury than routine practice. Kings and queens, of course, could afford a bath more often than ordinary peasants, but more often could mean once every few weeks or even months. In between these rare ablutions, people made do with washing their faces and hands. The body remained unwashed, covered with a layer of sweat, dirt, and grease. We brushed our teeth, but not like we did. Toothbrushes and toothpastes did not exist. People wiped their teeth and gums with a piece of cloth, sometimes soaked in wine or a special herbal decoction. They chewed parsley or cloves to freshen their breath. But this did not help much in the fight against tooth decay and gum disease. By the age of 30, many, even aristocrats, had already lost a significant part of their teeth. A poor diet rich in sugar, for those who could afford it, and devoid of vitamins exacerbated the problem. Therefore, bad breath was almost the norm. Clothing was also a source of odors. Linen or cotton underwear was changed relatively regularly, but outerwear made of expensive fabric such as velvet or brocade was almost impossible to wash. It was cleaned with brushes, weathered, but it still absorbed the smells of sweat, smoke from fireplaces, kitchen aromas, and the smell of sewage, which were full of streets and even castles. To break this miasma, the aristocracy used perfumes and incense abundantly. Musk, ambergris, frankincense. These strong, heavy aromas did not mask but rather mixed with the smells of an unwashed body, creating a complex and, for our nose, very specific bouquet. Now imagine the wedding night in such conditions. Two people, often very young, meet in a bedroom and are surrounded by a cloud of these smells. The smell of an unwashed body, stale breath, clothes soaked in sweat and perfume. It was a sensory reality that could not be escaped from. The romance we imagined could hardly survive in such an atmosphere. This was another aspect that made a royal marriage not a union of two lovers but a harsh duty. You had to share a bed with a person whose natural smells were not hidden by daily hygiene. It was a rough, unvarnished physical reality, far removed from our sterile and deodorized fantasies of the past. We have already touched on the topic of public consummation, but now let's look behind the curtain of the bed and consider the wedding night not as a social ritual, but as the personal experience of its two main participants. In our world, where everything is saturated with the ideas of romantic love and mutual consent, this night is seen as the culmination of emotional intimacy, the moment of expression of passion. In a medieval royal marriage, this concept would not only be alien, but absolutely incomprehensible. The wedding night was not about pleasure, not about tenderness, and certainly not about love. It was about one thing, about the fulfillment of duty. It was a cold, mechanical act that transformed marriage from a mere contract into a fait accompli. Imagine yourself in the shoes of a young princess, who may be only 12 or 14 years old. You grew up in a strict religious atmosphere where any talk about the body was forbidden. You were taught to be humble, obedient, and godly. And so, after a long, tiring day full of ceremonies and rituals, you are left in the bedroom with a man you barely know. He may be much older than you, speak a different language, and his appearance may cause you not sympathy, but fear. But feelings are not expected from you. You are expected to obey. You must fulfill what the church calls marital duty. It's not your choice, it's your responsibility. Probably the only thing you know about this act is that it is necessary to conceive an heir, and that it is likely to be painful and humiliating. For a young king or prince, the situation was not much easier. He was also weighed down by a huge burden of responsibility. He had to prove his masculinity, not only to his young wife, but also to the entire court, which, as we remember, could be right outside the door. Any failure, any hitch could be interpreted as a sign of impotence, which would be a disaster for his reputation and could even become a reason for the annulment of the marriage. He couldn't afford to be gentle or patient. He had to act quickly and decisively to prove his worth. In this atmosphere of pressure and fear, there was no room for foreplay, for exploring each other, for building intimacy. It was more of a medical procedure than an act of love. Consummation was a legal act. It was she who made marriage indissoluble. Without it, the union could easily be annulled, claiming that it was never completed. Therefore, there was a lot of pressure on the newlyweds to get the job done as soon as possible. In the morning, they were waiting for questions, direct or veiled, from courtiers and family members. It was expected that evidence would be presented, the same infamous sheets. For the girl, this meant a public demonstration of the most intimate aspect of her life. For a young man, it is a public confirmation of his masculine power. Pleasure, especially female pleasure, was not taken into account at all. It was neither a goal nor even a desirable side effect. The main thing is the legal consolidation of the union, and as a result, the beginning of a long and difficult path to the birth of an heir. That night was not the beginning of a love story, but the first chapter in a book of duties written by fear, politics, and dynastic necessity, in an effort to preserve the power, wealth, and purity of their blue blood within a narrow circle of families. European royal dynasties have for centuries practiced what we today instinctively aspire: closely related marriages. The idea was simple and, from their point of view, logical. Why give away valuable lands, titles, and princesses to strangers when you can strengthen ties with already trusted relatives? Cousins, uncles, and nieces. Such unions were not the exception, but rather the rule. The entire map of royal Europe turned into one gigantic, intricate pedigree, where everyone was each other's cousins to one degree or another. They have created a closed genetic ecosystem, unaware that by doing so they are launching a time bomb that will explode in a few generations. The church, as we remember, formally forbade marriages between close relatives. However, this ban was more of a tool of political bargaining than a real obstacle. For a certain fee or political concession, the Vatican almost always issued the necessary permission, dispensation, turning a blind eye to blood kinship. In this way, kings and queens received divine blessings for alliances that were biologically extremely risky. They believed that they were preserving the purity of the lineage, but in fact they concentrated in it not only the desired traits but also hidden recessive genes that carried information about various diseases and deformities. The consequences of this centuries-old practice were horrific and most clearly manifested in the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. They were so obsessed with preserving their heritage that they were constantly marrying each other. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins. As a result, from generation to generation, genetic defects accumulated and manifested themselves more and more. The most famous and tragic example was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, Charles II, who was a living illustration of genetic degeneration. He suffered from a whole bunch of diseases, was mentally retarded, could not speak normally due to a deformed jaw, the famous Habsburg lip, brought to the limit, and, most importantly for a monarch, was infertile. His death in 1700 interrupted the dynasty and plunged Europe into the devastating War of the Spanish Succession. But the Habsburgs were not the only ones. Hemophilia, the royal disease, became a curse for many European houses, including the Romanovs in Russia. This disease, which disrupts blood clotting, was inherited from Queen Victoria, who was the carrier of the defective gene, to her descendants, who went to all the courts of Europe. Mental illnesses such as porphyry, from which King George III of England, Mad King George, supposedly suffered, were also the result of inbreeding. In their arrogant desire to isolate themselves from the rest of the world and preserve their elitism, the royal families have driven themselves into a genetic impasse. They created a generation of monarchs who were physically and mentally weaker than their subjects, which ultimately undermined their authority and contributed to the fall of many monarchies. It was an ironic and cruel payback for believing that their blood was special. In the modern world, if a marriage does not work out, the couple has a civilized, albeit often painful, way out: divorce. In medieval Europe, especially in royal circles, everything was immeasurably more complicated. Marriage, sanctified by the Church, was considered an indissoluble sacrament, a union made in heaven. The phrase, "until death do you part," was taken literally. The idea of divorce in our understanding, that is, the dissolution of a legal marriage, simply did not exist. But what if the alliance became politically disadvantageous if the queen was infertile, or if the king simply wanted to get rid of her in order to marry another? For such cases, there was a cunning legal loophole: annulment. Annulment is not a divorce. Divorce ends an existing marriage, while annulment declares that the marriage never happened in the first place. It was a legal fiction, a way to circumvent the dogma of the indissolubility of marriage. To get an annulment from the Pope, good reasons were required, and a simple "did not get along in character" was not such. It was necessary to prove that some canonical laws were violated during the marriage, which made it invalid from a legal point of view. And the kings, along with their advisors and lawyers, showed miracles of ingenuity to find such reasons. The most common pretext was the presence of a forbidden degree of consanguinity. As we already know, European dynasties were closely intertwined, and it was not difficult to find a common ancestor. If a special papal permission, dispensation, was not obtained at the time of marriage, or if it could be proved that it was obtained by fraudulent means, this became an ideal basis for annulment. The irony was that this kinship was turned a blind eye when marriage was advantageous, and remembered as soon as it ceased to be so. Another popular reason was the statement that the marriage was not consummated, that is, physically consummated. This was difficult to prove or disprove, which opened the door to perjury and humiliating medical examinations. When there were no obvious reasons, it was necessary to resort to dirtier methods. The queen could be accused of the worst sins in order to make her a figure unworthy of being the king's wife, and thus push the church to annulment. Accusations of adultery, especially incest, incestuous affair with a relative, were particularly effective because they not only ruined the queen's reputation, but often led her straight to the chopping block. The infamous story of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, is a textbook example. When she failed to bear him a son, and he became infatuated with Jane Seymour, Anne was accused of numerous infidelities, including incest with her own brother. These accusations were most likely fabricated, but they allowed the king to get rid of her and annul their marriage, declaring their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. Thus, the royal divorce was not a civilized procedure, but a cruel political game, where the reputation, freedom, and even life of a woman were at stake. It was a process full of lies, betrayal, and legal manipulation, proving once again that in the world of big politics, all means are good to achieve the goal. While impeccable loyalty and chastity were required of the queen, and the slightest suspicion of treason could cost her her head, completely different standards were applied to the king. His extramarital affairs were not only not frowned upon, but were often taken for granted, as proof of his masculinity and strength. The royal court was a place where, next to the official family of the monarch, there was almost always another, shadowy family, his mistresses and their illegitimate children, the bastards. This double life of the king created a complex and tense dynamic, turning the court into an arena for jealousy, rivalry, and intrigue. The position of the official favorite, or maîtresse en titre, as she was called at the French court, was unique. She wasn't just a casual mistress. The most influential of them became real, uncrowned queens. They wielded great power, had their own palace apartments, luxurious upkeep, and had a significant influence on politics, art, and fashion. The king could discuss state affairs with them, entrust them with his secrets, which he may not have done with his lawful wife. Women like Madame de Pompadour or Diane de Poitiers in France were not just objects of royal passion, but major political figures capable of elevating their friends and destroying their enemies. For the legitimate queen, The existence of such a rival was a source of constant humiliation. She had to put up with her husband openly showing his affection for another woman. She was forced to meet with her favorite at court ceremonies, exchange polite but cold greetings with her, and pretend that nothing was happening. Any open demonstration of jealousy or hostility would have been perceived as inappropriate behavior and could only worsen her situation. The queen had to maintain her dignity, knowing that the entire court was comparing her to her younger, more beautiful, or more powerful rival. Her only trump card remained her official position, and most importantly, her ability to give birth to legitimate heirs. The children born of these extramarital affairs, the bastards, occupied a special and dual position. On the one hand, they had no right to the throne and bore the stigma of illegitimacy. On the other hand, if the king recognized them, they received titles, lands, and wealth. Royal bastards often entered into profitable marriages with representatives of the upper aristocracy, becoming the founders of new noble families. They could hold important positions in the army or at court. However, their presence was a constant reminder to the queen of her husband's infidelity and a potential threat to her own children. In times of political instability, there was always a risk that some influential bastard, enlisting the support of disgruntled nobles, might try to challenge the rights of the rightful heirs. This parallel family was the living embodiment of the double standards of the era and a constant source of tension that poisoned the life of the official royal family and added another layer of complexity to the already confusing world of court politics. We have already said that the queen's main task was to give birth to an heir, but this pressure did not end after the first successful pregnancy. It did not disappear even after the birth of a healthy boy. In fact, it haunted her throughout her life, turning her existence into a never-ending cycle of waiting, hope, and fear. In a world with a terribly high infant mortality rate, one heir was catastrophically few. Any disease, measles, smallpox, simple fever, could take the life of the little prince in a matter of days, and then the whole kingdom would again plunge into uncertainty. Therefore, the queen was required to give birth again and again, creating spare heirs to ensure the continuation of the dynasty. Each new pregnancy was a risky venture. As we will see later, the birth itself was deadly. But even up to this point, 9 months of bearing a child were full of anxiety. The queen was under constant surveillance. Her diet, her activity, her mood were all controlled. She was given countless pieces of advice, often contradictory and based on superstition rather than medical knowledge. She had to avoid bad omens, not look at ugly people or animals so that this would not affect the appearance of the child. Any ailment caused panic at court, and if, God forbid, a miscarriage occurred, it was perceived not as a personal tragedy, but as a failure of the state mission, and often the blame for this was placed on the queen herself, accusing her of negligence or even of a hidden sin. If she gave birth to daughters, the pressure only increased. Of course, princesses were useful for making dynastic alliances, but they could not ensure direct succession to the throne. Each newborn girl was another disappointment for the court and for the king. The queen could be reproached, albeit tacitly, for being incapable of giving birth to a boy. Although today we know that the sex of the child depends on the father. She saw her husband's interest fading, how he spent more and more time with mistresses who may have borne him bastard sons, which was an additional humiliation. She had to keep trying year after year, pregnancy after pregnancy, wearing out her body and her soul in pursuit of the desired son. Even when several healthy boys were lying in the cradle, the queen could not relax. She lived in constant fear for their lives. She knew that her position, her safety, and respect for her directly depended on the health of these children. She saw in every cough, in every scratch, a potential threat. In addition, she had to participate in a complex political game, protecting the interests of her children from other court factions, from the ambitions of influential aristocrats, and even from the possible claims of royal bastards. Her life was completely subordinated to this maternal or rather dynastic function. She could not be just a woman, just a wife. She was, first of all, a producer and keeper of heirs. This psychological burden was huge and did not leave her until her death. Her worth as a human being was inextricably linked to her reproductive capacity, and this turned her life into a never-ending race where the finish line was only death or the loss of the ability to give birth. A royal wedding was an event that required not only a lavish feast, but also grandiose entertainment that could impress the guests and demonstrate the power and generosity of the host. In an era devoid of modern forms of leisure, these entertainments had to be spectacular, loud, and exciting. And nothing met these requirements better than a jousting tournament. For us, the tournament is something from romantic novels. Noble knights in shining armor fight for the handkerchief of a beautiful lady. The reality, however, was much more brutal and bloody. The wedding tournament was not just a sports competition, but a real battle, which often ended in serious injuries and even death. Early tournaments, the so-called melee, were a massive imitation of combat. Two teams of knights, sometimes 100 men on each side, converged on a huge field and fought each other. The goal was not to kill, but to capture the enemy in order to demand a ransom for him later. Real military weapons were used: swords, axes, maces. Although the blades of swords were sometimes blunted, hitting a helmet or armor with a heavy weapon could still be fatal. In the heat of battle, the excitement prevailed, and the imitation of a battle easily escalated into a real massacre. Horses fell, breaking the legs of themselves and riders. Knights received terrible injuries, trampled to death in the general dump. The church repeatedly condemned tournaments as diabolical and sinful entertainment, but the aristocracy adored them. Later, individual fights or joustings became more popular. Two knights at full gallop rushed towards each other, trying to knock the opponent out of the saddle with a blow of a spear. It was incredibly spectacular, but also extremely dangerous. The spears were long and heavy, and the speed of the horses was enormous. Even if the spear broke on the shield as intended, its fragments could hit unprotected parts of the body or into the sight slit of the helmet. Falling from a horse in heavy armor weighing more than 20 kilograms was equivalent to falling from a motorcycle onto the asphalt and often led to fractures, concussions, and internal bleeding. History knows many examples when monarchs and noble aristocrats died in tournaments. The most famous case is the death of the French king Henry II in 1559. During a tournament held in honor of his daughter's wedding, a fragment of his opponent's spear hit him in the eye, and after several days of torment, he died. In addition to tournaments, guests were entertained by other, no less cruel spectacles. Hunting was a passion of the aristocracy, and animals were often hunted for the entertainment of guests. Bears, bulls, or wild boars were released into the arena, and a pack of dogs was set on them. This bloody spectacle, accompanied by the roaring of animals and the excited shouts of the audience, was considered quite acceptable entertainment. Theatrical performances, the so-called interludes, with allegorical plots were also arranged, but they could also be dangerous. The use of complex machinery, pyrotechnics, and fire in wooden halls often led to fires. Thus, wedding entertainment was a reflection of the cruel spirit of the era. They were loud, bloody, and dangerous, designed to demonstrate not so much sophistication as brute force and contempt for death. For the young bride watching all this, it was another shocking reminder of what a harsh and merciless world she found herself in. For a medieval woman, whether she was a peasant or a queen, childbirth was the most dangerous moment in her life. It was an event that took place on the verge of life and death. In our modern world, with its sterile hospitals, epidurals, and cesarean sections, we have forgotten what a terrifying ordeal childbirth has been for most of human history. For the queen, whose body was state property, childbirth turned into a public and risky act, surrounded not so much by medical care as by superstition and ignorance. When the queen went into labor, her chambers were filled with people, but they were not male doctors. Men, even the most learned ones, were generally forbidden to be present at childbirth. This sphere belonged entirely to women. The room was run by the head midwife, an experienced but often illiterate woman whose knowledge was based on years of practice and folklore traditions rather than science. She was surrounded by court ladies, relatives of the queen, and they all gave advice, prayed and fussed, creating an atmosphere of chaos and panic. Windows and doors were tightly closed to keep out evil spirits and drafts, which made the room unbearably stuffy. They lit candles in front of icons, read prayers, sprinkled everything with holy water. The medical knowledge of that time was extremely primitive. The anatomy and physiology of the birth process were shrouded in mystery. It was believed that the child actively makes his way out. Any complications baffled the midwives. If the child walked with his feet forward or was in the wrong position, it was almost impossible to do anything. The instruments used by the midwives were crude and unsterile, and their use often did more harm than good. The concept of antiseptics did not exist. Hands were not washed. Tools were not sterilized, which opened the gates for infections. Postpartum, or puerperal, fever was one of the main causes of female mortality. Even if the birth was successful, the woman could die in a few days from blood poisoning, and the doctors only helplessly shrugged their shoulders, attributing everything to the will of God. Pain was an integral part of the process. There were no painkillers. A woman had to endure painful contractions for hours and sometimes for days. It was believed that this suffering was her divine punishment for Eve's original sin, as it is said in the Bible, "In sickness you will bear children." Any attempt to relieve pain could be seen as a sin. The queen, despite her status, suffered just like any other woman. If the birth was delayed and the child could not be born naturally, the choice was terrible. Often it was necessary to sacrifice the child to try to save the mother, resorting to embryotomy, a horrific procedure for dismembering the fetus in the womb. A cesarean section was performed only on an already deceased woman, in a desperate attempt to save at least the child and have time to baptize him. It was impossible to survive after such an operation. Every birth was a game of Russian roulette for the queen. She knew she might not survive that day, and before retiring to her chambers, she often said goodbye to her family and put her affairs in order, as if preparing for death. When the young princess embarked on a long and dangerous journey to a foreign land to become queen, she did not ride alone. She was accompanied by a large retinue, maids of honor, chambermaids, a confessor, a personal secretary, grooms and servants. These people were the last island of her former life, the only familiar faces in the sea of strangers. At first glance, the retinue was her main support and consolation. These were people who spoke her native language, knew her habits, shared her culture. In the first, most difficult months of adaptation, when the queen felt isolated due to the language barrier and the hostility of the new court, communication with her retinue was the only outlet for her. They were her confidants, her friends, her family in exile. However, the role of this retinue was much more complex and ambivalent. For the court that received the new queen, her entourage was a source of constant suspicion. They were perceived not as personal servants but as foreign agents, spies sent by the queen's family to monitor what was happening and influence policy in the interests of their home country. And often these suspicions were not groundless. The queen's confessor could pass on her most intimate secrets heard in confession to her father, the king. Her secretary could conduct secret correspondence full of political secrets. Each lady-in-waiting could be the eyes and ears of a foreign ambassador. This espionage created an atmosphere of distrust around the queen and further isolated her from her husband and his court. The queen herself could not be completely sure of the loyalty of her retinue either. These people, although they came with her, had their own ambitions. They wanted to make a career, get positions, get married profitably. Their loyalty could be bought or won by one faction or another of the courtiers. The lady-in-waiting, who was her best friend today, could betray her tomorrow by telling her secrets to her enemies in exchange for a lucrative game or expensive jewelry. The queen had to constantly maneuver, trying to understand who from her entourage was truly loyal to her and who used the proximity to her for their own selfish purposes. Moreover, the presence of a large foreign retinue often irritated the local aristocracy. Local ladies and gentlemen claimed honorary and lucrative positions under the queen, but these places were occupied by outsiders. This gave rise to jealousy, enmity, and intrigues aimed at discrediting and expelling foreigners. Often one of the conditions of the marriage contract was the requirement that after a certain time the queen dissolve her retinue and replace them with representatives of the local nobility. It was a heavy blow for the queen. She was forced to give up her last friends, her only support, and to be left completely alone, surrounded by people she didn't know and couldn't trust. Thus, her retinue was both her salvation and her curse. They were her only allies in an alien world, but their presence made her even more alien and vulnerable, and their potential betrayal was the most terrible threat to her fragile position. The wedding feast, as we already know, was a demonstration of power and abundance. The tables were full of viands, wine flowed like a river, and the guests, forgetting about manners, indulged in gluttony. But in this noisy and seemingly cheerful chaos lurked a hidden and deadly danger. In a world where intrigue was the norm and political infighting knew no rules, food and drink could easily go from a source of pleasure to a murder weapon. Poisoning at a feast was a favorite method of eliminating political rivals. It was quiet, easy to disguise as a sudden illness, and in the hustle and bustle of the feast it was almost impossible to find the culprit. Imagine the castle's huge kitchen on the day of the feast. Dozens of cooks and servants rush back and forth, steam, smoke, screams everywhere. In such an environment, it was impossible to control the cooking process of each dish. Any servant, bribed or intimidated by the king's enemies, could discreetly add a pinch of colorless and odorless poison, such as arsenic, to the sauce, stew, or goblet of wine. The dish was sent to the common room, and no one would notice the substitution. The target could be not only the king himself or his fiancée, but also any influential guest, such as a duke, bishop, or foreign ambassador, whose removal benefited a particular faction. That is why there was a complex system of precautions. Dishes for the royal table were prepared separately, under the supervision of the most trusted chefs. Before serving, they were often covered with special lids and sealed so that no one could touch them on the way from the kitchen to the hall. And of course, the key role was played by the taster, or kravchi, who had to taste every dish and drink. But, as we said, this system was not perfect. The taster could be in cahoots with the poisoners, or a slow-acting poison could be used, which manifested itself only after a few hours or even days, when the feast was long over, and it was impossible to establish a connection between death and a particular dish. History and legends are full of stories of poisoning at feasts. While not all of them are documented, they reflect the real fear felt by the powerful. People knew that the tastiest piece of meat or the sweetest goblet of wine might be their last. This fear poisoned the very atmosphere of the holiday. The king and queen had to exercise extreme caution, trusting only a small circle of servants. They couldn't just enjoy the food like their guests. Every meal was a ritual full of suspicion. The foreign bride was especially vulnerable. She was a stranger. Her death could be beneficial to many. She did not yet know who in the court could be trusted and who should be feared. Any goblet of wine offered to her could be a trap. Thus, the wedding feast, a symbol of unity and joy, turned into an arena for a secret war. Behind the smiles and toasts, there were deadly conspiracies. And while the guests were admiring the roasted peacock, someone may have already counted down the last hours of the life of their victim, who carelessly raised a poisoned glass to the health of the newlyweds. It was the darkest side of medieval hospitality, where food could not only satiate but also kill. At the heart of any royal marriage was not an impulse of the heart, but a cold and calculating document, a marriage contract. It was not just a formality, but a complex legal treatise, which was compiled by the best lawyers of the two kingdoms. Negotiations on its content could go on for years, and every comma, every word in it was of great importance, since this document determined not only the future of the two people, but also the relations between the two states for decades to come. It was the foundation on which the entire alliance was built, and at the same time it was a time bomb if its terms were not clearly formulated. The content of the contract was extremely detailed. The first and most important point, of course, was the bride's dowry. The contract clearly spelled out its amount, composition, money, land, jewelry, trade privileges, and very importantly, the terms and procedure for payment. Any delay or failure to fulfill these obligations on the part of the bride's family could become a reason for a diplomatic scandal and a deterioration of her position at the new court. In turn, the contract also fixed what the bride received in return. This was the so-called widow's inheritance or mourning gift, certain lands, castles, and income that would ensure her existence in the event of her husband's death. It was her insurance, a guarantee that she would not remain poor and powerless in a foreign country. Further, the contract regulated the rights and status of future children. It clearly stipulated the order of succession to the throne. If, for example, the princess was from a ruling dynasty, the contract could state that she and her children renounced any claim to the throne of her home country. This was done in order to avoid in the future a situation where one monarch could inherit the crowns of two states, upsetting the political balance in Europe. The contract could also determine the titles that the children would receive and their upbringing. In addition to financial and dynastic issues, the marriage contract also affected the personal rights of the queen. It could stipulate that she had the right to keep her faith if it differed from her husband's faith. For example, a marriage between a Catholic and a Protestant. She could be guaranteed the right to have her own chapel and confessor. The contract determined the size and composition of her court, the number of ladies-in-waiting and servants she could bring with her, and the amount allocated for her personal expenses, the so-called pin money. These points were extremely important to ensure at least a minimum of independence and comfort for the queen in her new life. After all the points were agreed, the contract was drawn up in several copies, signed by the monarchs or their representatives, and sealed with heavy wax seals. It was an inviolable law. Any violation of it could become a pretext for war. Although it was intended to prevent conflicts, its complexity and the ambiguity of some of its wording often became a source of controversy themselves. Lawyers on both sides could argue for years about the interpretation of this or that clause. Thus, the marriage contract was the quintessence of medieval diplomacy. It was pedantic, calculating, devoid of any sentiment and completely focused on material and political interests. He was a true testimony that a royal marriage is not a union of people, but a fusion of crowns. For the queen, whose life was subordinated to duty from birth, the death of her husband, the king, was an event that radically changed her fate. Widowhood could be both a long-awaited liberation for her and the beginning of a new, even more terrible imprisonment. Everything depended on many factors. Her age, whether she had adult sons, her political weight, and the relationships that she managed to build at court during the years of her marriage. Her future was unpredictable, and she could either rise to the pinnacle of power or be thrown into complete oblivion. If the queen was the mother of a new king who was too young to rule on his own, she became regent. It was her finest hour. From the shadow of her husband, she came to the forefront of political life and took the reins of power into her own hands. The Dowager Queen Regent wielded great power. She ruled the country, appointed ministers, negotiated and commanded armies. Many of the most prominent and influential rulers in history, such as Catherine de' Medici in France or Maria Theresa in Austria, came to power precisely as regents for their sons. For an intelligent and ambitious woman, widowhood was the only chance to realize her potential and rule de facto, if not de jure. It was liberation from the subordinate position of the wife and the opportunity to go down in history. However, not all widows were waiting for such an enviable fate. If the queen had no sons, or if her son was already an adult and did not need her care, her position became extremely precarious. She was losing her main status, the status of the wife of the reigning monarch. Her daughter-in-law, the wife of the new king, became the new mistress of the court. Yesterday's ruler turned into a dowager queen, an honorable figure but often devoid of real influence. She could be pushed into the background, deprived of her apartments in the palace and reduced maintenance. It became a living reminder of the past, which the new regime sought to forget as soon as possible. In the worst case, widowhood turned into a real prison. If the queen had bad relations with her stepson or with powerful court factions, she could be considered a threat. She could be accused of plotting to install another candidate on the throne, or of witchcraft to influence the new king. Under this pretext, she could be isolated from the court, exiled to a remote castle, or even worse, imprisoned in a monastery. The monastery was a gilded cage for the dowager queen. Formally, she withdrew from the world in order to devote herself to prayer, but in practice she was deprived of freedom, contact, and any opportunity to influence politics. It was a way to politely and piously get rid of an uncomfortable figure. In addition, the young and attractive dowager queen was a problem in itself. Her possible new marriage could create political complications. If she married a powerful local aristocrat, it could strengthen his faction and upset the balance of power. If she were to return to her homeland and marry there, it could create an unwanted foreign alliance. Therefore, her marriage, as in her youth, continued to be managed by others. Thus, the death of her husband did not always bring the queen freedom. She only changed one form of addiction for another, and her fate was still decided in the offices of politicians, not in her own heart. We spent a lot of time immersing ourselves in the dark, personal, and often tragic details of medieval royal weddings. We talked about fear, humiliation, political intrigue, and personal grief hidden behind pompous ceremonies. It's easy to get caught up in these micro-stories and forget about the big picture. But now, at the end of our journey, let's take a step back and see what all these sacrifices have led to. What was the legacy of these unions, built not on love, but on cold calculation? The answer is simple and grandiose. These marriages, full of tears and suffering of individuals, literally carved out the modern map of Europe. Each marriage contract was, in fact, a geopolitical contract. When a princess married, her dowry often included not only gold, but entire provinces. Lands that had belonged to one crown for centuries could peacefully pass under the rule of another, with just the stroke of a pen on a marriage document. For example, the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II of Plantagenet in the 12th century brought the English crown vast territories in France, including the Duchy of Aquitaine. This event laid the groundwork for the centuries-old conflict between England and France, which culminated in the 100 Years' War. The borders were moved not by armies, but by wedding corteges. Dynastic marriages created complex networks of claims that determined European politics for centuries. When a ruling dynasty faded away, as happened with the Spanish Habsburgs, a pan-European struggle for the liberated inheritance began. Kings of other countries whose grandmothers or great-grandmothers were Spanish princesses immediately claimed their rights to the throne. The War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century, in which almost all of Europe was involved, was a direct consequence of the marriage policy of previous generations. The fates of millions of ordinary people who died on the battlefields were decided by family trees in the terms of long-forgotten marriage contracts. These alliances not only transferred lands but also created entire empires. The Habsburg Empire, on which the sun was said never set, was built not so much by the sword as by marriage. Their motto was, "Let others wage wars. You, happy Austria, get married." Bella gerent Ali to Felix Austria Nubi. Through a series of incredibly successful and strategically calibrated marriages, they united Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, part of Italy, and huge colonies in the New World under their rule. A fragile girl who went to a foreign country to marry a stranger carried in her luggage not just dresses and jewelry, but the future of entire continents. Thus, behind every line in the history textbook, behind every changed border, behind every war for inheritance, are the fates of these women and men, their personal tragedies, their repressed feelings, their bodies turned into a state resource, were the invisible price that history paid for the formation of modern nations. Looking at a map of Europe today, we see the result not only of great battles and revolutions, but also of quiet, often unfortunate alliances made in cold castles centuries ago. This is the most important and most ironic legacy of the dark secrets of medieval royal weddings. Big politics was born from personal grief, and borders of states were born from broken destinies. And now, our long and not very funny story comes to an end. We walked through the cold halls of the castles, overheard the whispers of the intriguers, felt the fear of the young bride and the weight of the crown. We saw how pain, calculation, and human tragedies were hidden behind the glitter of the ceremonies. History is rarely the same as it is depicted in fairy tales. It is full of dirt, injustice, and harsh realities. But this knowledge should not depress us. On the contrary, it should help us appreciate the world in which we live now. Think about your bed, about a soft pillow under your head, about a warm blanket. Think about the peace and quiet in your room. You don't have to be afraid that there are witnesses behind the door. You don't have to worry that your dinner is poisoned. You don't have to get married to ensure peace between the two countries. Your life, with all its modern complexities and anxieties, is yours. You can love whoever you want. You can choose your destiny. This is a luxury that a medieval queen could not even dream of. So let these dark stories about the past become a kind of lullaby for you. Let them carry away your present worries, showing how insignificant they can be in comparison with the weight of the ages. Relax your shoulders, take a deep, slow breath, and exhale. Feel the tension leave your body. History is asleep, and it's time for you to follow suit. Go to sleep calm and deep, to sleep protected from all the ghosts of the past.